Next.
Tonight, we bring you round 7 of the CVC Law Debate Season 5. For this debate, two teams take on press freedom and whether or not physical violence against a journalist on duty is a violation of that right. I'm Mike Yoreta. Hello, and welcome to Square Off the CVC Law Debates. Airport brawl and a missing Jordanian journalist. Journalists became the story in some of the biggest headlines in the past 2 months. Last May, a tussle between journalist Ramon Tulfo and celebrity couple Raymar Santiago and Claudine Barreto stole the spotlight. The cause? Tulfo was supposedly taking a video of the actress arguing with airline personnel.
Yung pinakikita ninyong kagandahang asal at kagandahang loob sa harap ng kamera, hindi pala totoo yan. Yung mga maliliit na tao, igalang ninyo dahil may mga dignidad din yan.
Soon, violence erupted.
Nag-aalam martial arts siya doon. The reason kung bakit siya nabugbog o nasuntok, dahil pinuprotektahan lang ako ng asawa ko at ng mga kaibigan ko.
In June, a Jordanian journalist and his Filipino crew went missing as they were supposedly headed to interview the Abu Sayyaf in Sulu. Conflicting reports came out. Some speculated that Atyani was kidnapped, while others said that he was being held against his own will.
Hindi po siya sinasaktan, hindi po siya ina-under ng mental or physical deprivation. Ang ano lang po, confined lang po siya sa isang area dahil nga gumagawa pa sila ng.
Baka ito mga may connection sa Al-Qaeda and then they are because of the strict ng implementation of the AMLA. Baka sabi ko nagtadala ito ng pondo para yan. Baka meron silang arrangement, di ba? Na ito-interview yung mga nakasama rin na mga Al-Qaeda.
Does physical violence against a journalist constitute a violation of press freedom? Arguing for the affirmative side is the University of Santo Tomas. Driven by truth and honor, the law students from the Royal Pontifical University of Santo Tomas. Born into a family of doctors, Jamaica Fama is committed to becoming the very first lawyer in her family. John Henry Tamayo describes himself as a man for others. When he isn't studying, he likes to busy himself with outreach programs and with other community-oriented activities. Joy Binay is spirited and ambitious. She says she wants to one day be known the world over for her savvy litigating skills. Team University of Santo Tomas, committed, passionate, competent. Taking on the negative side is the San Sebastian College Recoletos de Manila. Driven by their passion for learning, the next generation lawyers from San Sebastian College Recoletos de Manila. Raisa Laurel is famous for her courage and her undefeatable spirit. Through her story of triumph over affliction and through her passionate pursuit of a degree in law, she continues to inspire us all. Kaiser Saba is a recipient of Gawad Binhis Natatanging Kabataan ng Tanawan Award. And in his spare time, he teaches philosophy to high school students. Paul Tena is a dedicated student who looks up to icons such as Og Mandino and Martin Luther King Jr. He says he wants to become a lawyer to fight for the greater good. Team San Sebastian College Recoletos de Manila. Driven, determined, passionate. Now let's meet our distinguished judges. First off, we have attorney Salvador Panelo. He's a faculty member at the University of the East College of Law. Next, we have CVC Law Partner attorney Aida Araceli Rojas Rivera. And our chief adjudicator for this evening, Judge Severino De Castro Jr. of the Regional Trial Court Branch 82 in Quezon City. The word war begins when Square Off the CVC Law Debates turns. Please stay tuned.
Most of the stories develop in the afternoon. The challenge is to break the news first. Expect us to give you the news as soon as they happen. News now at 2 p.m. Only here on ANC, the ABS-CBN News channel.
While your business day is hopefully winding down, we're going to be starting up. We're going to bridge the gap between your morning news and Business Nightly.
News Now with Coco Alquaz, 3 p.m. here on ANC, the ABS-CBN News channel.
We're using a modified Oregon-Oxford format. The debate is between two sides, the affirmative and negative, with 3 members each. Each debater from the affirmative side argues either the necessity, beneficiality, or practicability of the proposition, while the counterpart debaters on the negative side oppose these arguments. Each debater is given 4 minutes to deliver a constructive speech and rebut the previous argument. Each debater is given 2 minutes to interpolate or to cross-examine the opposing debater. Only categorical questions may be asked. Each of the 3 judges may ask 1 question of each speaker within that speaker's time limit. The chief judge rules in the event of ties, objections, or contestations. The judges' total scores determine the best speaker and the winning team. Tonight's proposition: let it be resolved that physical violence against a journalist while performing his duties is a violation of the freedom of the press. Starting off for the affirmative side is Joy Binay. Joy, you have 4 minutes to argue the need to consider physical violence against a journalist a violation of press freedom.
Your Honors, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. With this motion, I as the first speaker will talk about 2 main points. First, why it is necessary to consider physical violence as a form of restraint. That is why it is a violation of freedom of the press. And second, why it is necessary to consider that physical violence is not only a violation against the journalist per se, but against democracy. First, on my first point, it is necessary to consider that physical violence is a form of restraint because we base this on the premise that prior restraint and subsequent punishment, as considered in the Constitution, are considered violations because of restraint, which is manifest when they stop a journalist physically or directly from covering the incident, the contents are subject to censorship, or when the information is being prevented from being disseminated to public. And second, when at a certain extent, it leads to self-censorship, which forces the journalist to repress certain information that he had gathered for the fear of reprisal and punishment. We say that it's a constitutional guarantee. However, that time, it is only the state that can violate such freedom. However, because of the change of the factual milieu, as we can see as the Maguindanao massacre, or even in the news, that certain private individuals or public personality in a public incident can now provide restraint through physical violence. We say that whenever the journalist journalist is gathering data, they are in the stage wherein they are susceptible for physical violence because it is the stage wherein they are in direct contact with their subject. And we say that physical violence, wherein they are assaulted knowingly and inflicted with pain while recording, while interviewing or asking questions. We say that the moment that you inflict physical pain towards that journalist in the process of data gathering in itself already amounts to interference of the reception of the information. And second, such pain inflicted will at a certain extent lead to self-censorship. And we say that such restraint is amounting or has the same effect as the constitutional violation now, which is prior restraint and subsequent punishment. We say that when the journalists become subject of physical violence in the performance of their duties, not only that their human rights are being violated, but also that their exercise of freedom of the press is also violated as they are prevented from gathering certain information. Which leads me to my second point in how, yes, Your Honor.
Please use your mic, attorney.
My question, Madam Speaker, would be, wouldn't the characterization of the assault as a violation of the freedom of the press grant greater means for the press to intrude into the private lives of individuals?
Madam Speaker, thank you for, Your Honor, thank you for the question. Your Honor, journalists in the performance of their duties are taking into consideration not the person per se, but the acts of this private person in public. Where in the case of Ayer versus Capulong, that whenever they act in public, they surrender part of their lives they surrender part of their private lives in the relation that whenever the journalist deem that it is newsworthy, that it becomes a public incident which can be covered. On my second point, I'm gonna argue on how physical violence is a violation of democracy. Because freedom of the press is a cycle that does not end with journalists alone. It concedes to the fact that whenever the journalist receives an information, it has a connotation that they will disseminate it to the public. And we say that physical violence at any stage of journalism, whether in data gathering, in writing, or even in publication, whenever that they are being violated or restrained, is already amounting to violation of the freedom of the press.
Okay, wrap it up,
Thank
Joy.
you. Last, I would like to highlight that the offender is not punished here just because he attacked a journalist, but because he attacked a person, which is a journalist, which
Okay.
in essence is embodied.
Joy, that's all the time we can give you.
Democratic society. Thank you.
Kaiser, 2 minutes now to cross-examine her.
Good evening, members of the chair. Ms. Speaker, is the constitutional provision, Article 3, Section 4, absolute or limited?
Limited.
It is
Freedom of the press can only be violated by
absolute
the
or
state.
limited? Yes or no? Is it always absolute? Yes or no?
At a certain extent, no.
Definitely, it's not. Now, does it have a specific parameter saying that these circumstances are the only way of committing these violations, and these circumstances are the only way wherein this freedom of press can be violated?
Freedom of the press can be violated by the state only, and by the private individuals by physically assaulting them.
Enough.
Any
Next,
form of
is
restraint.
force equivalent to violence? Is force equivalent?
Unreasonable force is.
Exactly. There is unreasonable forms. Now, are all forms of violence unlawful?
When you inflict it to journalists in the performance of your duty, which
At
is,
all times.
when you inflict it in a journalist in the performance of their duty, you necessarily interfere
Good.
with their job.
Okay. So, would you agree with me, Ms. Speaker, if I say that violence is if violence is not done unlawfully, then of course it is within the parameters of the law, right?
Yes, it's in the status
Definitely,
quo.
that's common sense. Now, if there is no exact parameter on what is in accordance of freedom of speech or what is in violence of freedom of the press, then would you agree with me if I say that violence may be a valid exercise of freedom of the press?
Mr. Speaker, that's
Is it? Yes or no?
No.
Exactly. That is what I want to point out because Mr. Chair and members of this House, later on as the opposition will express their side, you will know that they should have qualified the violence that they are talking about in this debate because failure to qualify such violence will not automatically be tantamount to a violation of the freedom of the press.
Okay, Kaiser, 4 minutes now to rebut Joy and argue why it's not necessary to consider physical violence against a journalist a violation of the freedom of the press.
Okay, good evening, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chair and members of this House. Now, first I would like to rebut on her points. Number one, the first speaker of the affirmative side expressed that physical violence is tantamount to self-censorship, repressive acts. Let us just go back to Maguindanao massacre and that the very fact that data gathering itself and then a violation was inflicted was already a violation of human rights. We oppose on the opposition side. Why is that, Mr. Chair and members of this House? If we shall recall in the case of PBM Employees Association versus PBM, it was clearly stated that there was a hierarchy of rights. What is that? Right to life is above all. Now, let us put this into context, Mr. Chair and members of this House. What if I am being interviewed by a journalist for an alleged corruption? And then I'm standing, I'm answering her questions, and then here comes a third person, an avid supporter of mine without my control. Here she comes and then she has this knife and she was about to stab the journalist. And then in order for me to save her life, I push her so that there will be no violence on her part. They failed to qualify, Mr. Chair and members of this House. Therefore, it is our right to oppose that not all forms of violence is tantamount to freedom of the press. In fact, in the case that I just mentioned, I even protected the right of the person. Now, on the second part of the argumentation, freedom of the press limits democracy. Democracy itself is not absolute, Mr. Chair and members of this House. If we shall recall in the case of espuelas versus people, if we are really saying that this is a violation of democracy, then why is it that in that case it ruled that if the language of the press is beyond the limits, then definitely it will not be constitutional. Hence, we have the right to protect it. Another one is also stated in the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, because in that case, Mr. Chair, it also says that if it is inciting to violence or to the breach of peace, then definitely we can also impose violence in order to prevent it. So now going to my speech, what is it that the opposition wants to happen? Yes, we do concede to the fact, Mr. Chair and members of this House, that there are violence that are really tantamount to violation of freedom of press. But since they failed to qualify, we shall qualify it for them, saying that not all forms of violence is tantamount to the violation of freedom of press. Why is that? We have the concept of necessary violence. When is this necessary violence present? Necessary violence is present is if there is really a circumstance existing wherein you really need to exert force in order to repel the violence on the part of the journalist. One concrete example, Mr. Chair, is what happened during the Luneta siege. You know why the Luneta siege failed? Because violence was not, in a way, they did not listen. They were not convinced by the violence that were exerted to them. Why is that, Mr. Chair and members of this House? Violence was inflicted upon the members of that press in that scenario because they wanted to hide the plan of the police. But then here comes the press. They were not overthrown by that violence. They were still there. What happened? The plan elapsed. A victim was killed. So what is it that we want to happen, Mr. Chair and members of this House? That not in all cases, violence is tantamount to a violation of freedom of press. And with that, we believe that the opposition clearly established that this is not absolute and that this debate should go to us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kaiser. Joy, 2 minutes now to cross-examine him.
Mr. Speaker, good evening.
Good evening.
Mr. Speaker, is physical violence towards a journalist a violation?
Not at all times.
Mr. Speaker, is assaulting ever a violation? Is assaulting another person a violation?
Not at all times.
Mr. Speaker, when you violate the rights of a person, can you be subject to civil, criminal, administrative sanction?
Not at all times, Ms. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we concede the fact that there are justified and mitigating
Yes, because
circumstances.
exactly
But this
that is
debate
what-
is about journalists
Yes,
in the
and we
performance of
admitted
their
to the
duty.
fact that
Okay, Mr.
violence
Speaker,
may be
yes
imposed
or no?
upon
Yes or
them.
no?
Okay.
When you infringe a constitutional right, is it considered a violation?
When a constitutional right is
Yes
about
or no, Mr.
another
Speaker?
constitutional right, then it shall
Mr.
be justified.
Speaker, have you
Ms.
read
Speaker.
Article 32 of the New Civil Code?
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, do you consider the freedom of the press a constitutional right?
What is the governing law above all? Isn't it the Constitution? And isn't
Mr.
it that, sir, when it ruled that
Mr.
there is a
Speaker,
hierarchy
Article
of rights,
32.
we should prioritize
Mr. Speaker,
that
yes
right
or no?
above all?
Mr. Speaker?
Yes, I read that, and I'm just qualifying my answer in accordance with our argument.
Mr. Speaker, can you assault another person without violating their rights?
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, is it the debate about the physical violence or assault towards
Physical
a
violence
journalist
that you should have
in the
qualified in order for you to win, because not all forms of
Mr.
violence
Speaker,
is
what
tantamount
I'm-
to a violation
Mr.
of the
Speaker?
freedom of the press.
Mr. Speaker, is physical violence towards a journalist in the performance of their duty, assaulting them or kicking them while interviewing you ever correct or right?
Not at all times it's
Mr.
wrong.
Speaker, it is wrong to assault
No,
another
it's
person.
wrong if at all times you shall assume
Mr.
that
Speaker,
it
it's
is
my time. I'm
always
asking
lawful.
questions. Mr. Speaker, is it ever okay that while interviewing another person that you're going to be punched or kicked? Is it ever just a violation? Is it a violation of your human
It
right?
depends on the intent,
Mr.
Ms. Speaker.
Yes.
It depends on the
Mr.
intent.
Speaker, by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, yes, it is.
What?
Mr.
If-
Speaker, second,
what?
don't
Would
argue
you
with me.
rather
Mr.
sacrifice
Speaker?
the life
Mr.
in
Speaker?
order? No, no.
You're wasting
Yes,
my time.
yes, yes, I am.
Second, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, time's up, Joy. Second affirmative speaker, John, you have 4 minutes for your constructive speech on why it would be beneficial to consider physical violence against a journalist a violation of press freedom.
Your Honors, members of this House, good evening. The position of UST law is very simple, and that is physical violence is a form of threat to the exercise of freedom of the press as it causes chilling effect. Your Honors, it is very simple that we can really understand that the motion presupposes or assumes already that physical violence is unreasonable. The question that we should answer in this debate first, Your Honors, is whether or not that physical violence is tantamount to a violation of freedom of the press. In response to the change of factual milieu as characterized by the first speaker, Your Honors, and considering the status quo that now not only the government now is capable of impairing the freedom of the press but also private individuals at that, there is a greater need for the state, Your Honors, to step in with regard to the furtherance of safety of journalists, Your Honors, in the performance of their duties. What we want to be very clear at the very outset, that the physical violence committed against a journalist is not just a simple physical injury, Your Honors, but rather equivalent to an attack against the freedom of the press in general, taking into consideration the constitutional duty of that journalist to inform the public. What we want to be very clear further, Your Honors, that we cannot separate the person here of the journalist from the profession per se, considering the fact that he is the representation of journalism in the very first place. As a beneficiality speaker, Your Honors, I will discuss two things. First is the benefit that the proposition actually affords greater protection to journalists. And second, Your Honors, is the proposition sets a good precedent to society. On the first benefit, Your Honors, according to the UNESCO 2010 report, the safety of journalists is actually essential to protect the rights of all citizens to reliable information and the right of journalists, Your Honors, to provide it without fear for security. When journalists, Your Honors, carry out their journalistic investigation and report with fear for reprisal because at any rate there is a threat of physical violence, there becomes a chilling effect. Meaning, Your Honor, that fear hampers the journalist from effectively disposing his duties and thus results to a violation of right to information. Your Honors, as stated by Justice Abad Santos. Yes, Your Honors.
Is it not the fact that the freedom of the press enshrined in the Constitution is not without any limitation, as it is in fact also subject to corresponding responsibilities and accountabilities vis-a-vis the individual's exercise of his right to privacy?
Thank you for that question, Your Honor. This position of UST law is without saying that it does not have limitations. It has limitations, but remember that the strictest scrutiny standard should be employed in admitting actions that restrict the exercise thereof, as stated in the case, Your Honors, of Chavez versus Gonzalez. Thank you, Your Honors, as I move on. Now, on the contrary, when we consider physical violence as a ground for violation of freedom of the press, we actually provide these journalists a working environment where there is no fear of threats or results for that matter. On the second benefit, that it actually sets a good precedent to society. The rule of law shall be upheld in all times. However, Your Honors, physical violence as a remedy is very much uncalled for and certainly not a plausible response to a violation of a right for that matter, Your Honors. While it may be the case that, for example, Your Honors, the journalist has exceeded his authority or has violated the right of privacy, for example, still that begs the question, Your Honors, does that give the private person the right to actually hurt or physically assault the journalist? We say no, Your Honors, because first, we recognize his right to life, and second, Your Honors, we actually condemn the idea of anyone who takes the law into their own hands, something which is not really favored by law and something that we will not do because we cannot enforce our right by violating another right. In other words, Your Honors, there has to be a lawful process and the system needs to be respected by all means. So what is the message then that we're trying to send in this debate? It is that the moment that we put a restraint on the functions of our journalists, such as in this case, Your Honors, the infliction of physical injuries, we in effect put a limitation on the freedom of the press and something that we cannot really deny and we cannot neglect, Your Honors, because we say that that is detrimental to this democratic society. Thank you.
Raisa, 2 minutes now to cross-examine him.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker.
Good evening, Raisa.
Yes. Is freedom of the press absolute?
We say that it is not.
It's not, yes. Is physical violence and murder different or the same? Yes. Is it different? Yes or no?
It's different, yes.
As qualified in criminal law, right?
Yes, it's different.
Do you agree that the media has a tendency to sensationalize news?
But
yes
would you agree with me also that your fear is speculative?
Okay. Is there a tendency to abuse their rights?
There is no tendency at all because that is speculative to begin with.
Again, does it benefit public officials?
Your question is misleading, madam. It will actually result to a benefit of public officials. I cannot answer. Thank you.
In the beneficiality aspect, Mr. Speaker, does this benefit the public officials?
We are not speaking the benefit of public officials themselves, but we are speaking of the benefit of the society as a whole because that is the concern of this debate to begin with.
But in our paradigm, Mr. Speaker, it affects not only the journalists, not only the public, but also the public officials.
Madam Speaker, we are not saying that we will actually drop down another right. We are saying that we will admit exceptions according to the rule of law.
Okay, Mr. Speaker. Why is it necessary to restrain the journalists from performing their task?
There's no necessity to restrain the duties of journalists precisely because we said that it is accompanied by a constitutional right to inform the public.
Yes, it is their right exactly to inform the public, but there are limitations as well, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, we admit because we concede. We submit
and
to
we
that.
will qualify it later in our
okay, thank
statement.
you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. No more questions, Raisa?
Yes, ma'am.
You have 4 minutes now to rebut John and argue why it would not be beneficial to equate physical violence against journalists as a violation of the freedom of the press.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of this House. While we do not agree with the paradigm of the affirmative, that their paradigm their paradigm has collapsed. Although we are conceding that any form of violence per se is not good, since it will, and if we will not qualify it, these forms of violence will cause greater injury. On the other hand, here is our paradigm. The paradigm of opposition, which has more benefits because it caters not only to one sector, but all the stakeholders. First, the benefits of the journalist. Mr. Chair and members of this House, we would like to protect these hardworking journalists as they provide us with a chief source of information on the current affairs of the country. After all, we are basing this on the role of protecting in the doctrine of parens patriae, which the government may act as a guardian of the rights of the people who may be disadvantaged or suffering from some disability or misfortune, as cited in the case of Government of the Philippines versus Montepiedad. In line with this, our paradigm would protect the journalists by inflicting necessary force, as the first speaker said earlier, necessary force, so that they would not inflict greater detriment. So remember the case in Manila Peninsula way back in 2010. According to our very reliable source, hundreds of journalists were asked by the police officials or military authorities to vacate the premises, but they opted to stay. In effect, public authorities employed necessary force just to ask them leave the premises. Yes, ma'am.
Madam Speaker, wouldn't you agree with me when you say that if we accept your proposition, wouldn't that promote vigilantism?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. Ma'am, because we need to qualify the force exerted against a journalist, or not all forms of force, ma'am, are violative of the freedom of the press, ma'am. Going back, in effect, public authorities employ necessary force just to ask them leave the dangerous area. But in this case, freedom of the press is not violated, since it is also the duty of the state to protect the safety of the journalist. Yes, we recognize that the duties of the journalist is to keep us informed. But we and the state are also after their security, the journalist security. And again, reiterating the concept of parens patriae. Now we go to our second group of beneficiaries, which are the public officials. Public officials, being elected by the people, are subject to public scrutiny, leaving them with narrower privacy rights as provided. But despite this reality, the Constitution still provides for the broad protection of their constitutional rights, especially when they are not performing their duties. And as public officials, they're expected to be transparent and accountable in their terms of current plans and future plans in our country. But it does not entail disclosing their private life, for example, their dating life, which is not necessary in their work, right? And lastly, we have the Manila hostage crisis. Chinese nationals were injured over a dismissed officer attempted to get his job back, remember? The grueling hours of negotiation suddenly broke down when the hostage taker witnessed the live coverage of his brother being arrested by the media. And thus, it is undeniable that the overzealous media coverage of the incident may have jeopardized the police rescue operation, remember, by giving the hostage taker a bird's eye view of the whole situation. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House, we have the last beneficiary, which are the private individuals. And the means employed by the journalist is unethical or libelous. It shall be lawful for the private individual to inflict force because he needs to protect the rights as enshrined in Article 2, Section 1 and the Article 19 of the Civil Code, as we all know.
Okay.
And if this right is violated, can I wrap up, ma'am? Last. If this right is violated, then this private individual may again resort to violence as justified by the clear and danger rule in the Chavez case, as you said earlier, the Chavez case.
Okay, thank you, Raisa. John, 2 minutes now to cross-examine her.
Good evening, Raisa.
Good evening.
You mentioned earlier in your speech that we abide by the principle of parens patriae.
Yes.
Okay. Do you also recognize that journalists are individuals themselves to which the state has the obligation to protect?
Exactly, Mr.
Okay, thank you for that concession. So, let me ask you this question. Are you for the safety of journalists, yes or no?
Safety of the journalists, the public officials, and everyone. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Are journalists now safe while performing their duties at present?
But do they tend sometimes to abuse it?
Yes or
yes,
no,
but
madam?
they sometimes tend to abuse it. Remember, Mr.
Yes,
Speaker?
you said yes. So I will admit that. If yes, so a journalist being beaten up for covering a story involving a public officer, for example, and that public officer actually beats up that journalist, do you think that is the definition of safety?
If it's necessary, sir, to employ that force, then why not?
Madam Speaker, if we afford special protection against violence, do you think that constitutes safety?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry.
If we afford special protection against violence, do you think that constitutes safety?
Yes, not
Thank
at all
you.
times.
Okay. Next question. Have you read the UNESCO 2010 report?
Yes.
So you are aware that the Philippines is listed as one of the countries that have the highest number of killed and abused journalists, correct?
Yes, but that doesn't mean that employing force
Madam,
would be
thank
necessary.
you. My time. With this UNESCO report, would you agree with me that at the moment, physical violence against journalists is rampant, and therefore freedom of the press gets to be curtailed?
But you didn't qualify again, Mr. Speaker, which is necessary and necessary
I'm
force.
entitled to qualify because I am the one asking your questions. Would you agree with me, madam, that journalists have to be presumed to be acting in good faith in performing their duty?
Of course, but they tend sometimes to abuse it, remember?
Therefore, by that presumption of good faith, you agree with me that it is not right for us to expect that that journalist will tend to abuse his power.
Not at all times.
Assuming the right to privacy is violated, Madam Speaker, through, for example, publication, the person whose right to privacy was violated can file a claim for damages, correct?
Okay. John, Raisa, your time is up.
Therefore, the infliction of
John,
physical
that's
injury
it.
is
Thank
uncalled
you.
for. Thank you.
Third affirmative speaker, Jamaica, 4 minutes to argue why it would be practicable to consider violence against a journalist as a violation of press freedom.
Good evening, Your Honors. The problem with the opposition side is that they are out of the spirit of the motion, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot expect us to argue against necessary force because the arguing against necessary force would not make or won't make this debate palatable at the end of the day because necessary force is already enforced in status quo. They have already burden pushing us, but ladies and gentlemen, we cannot argue what is already recognized by law. That's why we set it up, that's why we set up the motion wherein journalists are in the performance of their duties and are experiencing unreasonable force. Second, the opposition side is talking about journalists who are abusing the performance of their duties. But ladies and gentlemen, the motion assumes that, or the motion forwards the assumptions that journalists here are acting within their duties. They are not in the spirit of the motion, ladies and gentlemen. Third is that the opposition did not clearly understand the motion because what the motion calls for is to weigh between right to privacy versus right freedom of the press and not against right to life. And in hierarchy of rights, ladies and gentlemen, the freedom of the press is preferred over right to privacy, especially when the it is covered, when the event that it covers is a matter paramount to public concern. Now let me move on to my speech, ladies and gentlemen. Journalists are facing unreasonable work hazards every time they are in the process of creating and delivering matters paramount to public concern. Threats, physical injuries, and worse, death. While we have substantive laws protecting freedom of the press embodied in our constitutions, the status quo is still problematic. Why? This is because status quo is failing to realize that journalism, as an exercise of the freedom of the press, is not only limited to writing and publishing. It is evident in the acts of journalism who are in the performance of their duties that journalism has 3 general stages, namely news gathering, news writing, news publication, or news broadcast. The wordings of the law and even the rulings of the Supreme Court has not made any pronouncement that the exercise of freedom of the press is limited to writing and publication. Hence, it could be easily inferred that they meant to allow freedom of the press to encompass all stages that journalists undertake in the process of creation and dissemination of news. However, despite all these, the stage of news gathering, which is the bulk of journalism, is not highlighted. And with the change in factual milieu, as argued by my first speaker, we need to highlight the stage of news gathering to be able to acquire the benefits forwarded by my second speaker. And as the third speaker, I will argue that the most practicable way of doing it is by treating physical violence as a violation of the freedom of the press. And I will prove these to you by asking and answering these questions. First question, can it be done, ladies and gentlemen? We say in the affirmative side that yes, it is capable of being done because we already have the starting components in the status quo. We already have highlighted 2 stages, which is 2 stages of journalism. But let me emphasize that what we have are only starting components. While the status quo has already highlighted news writing and news publishing, it has left news gathering open for attacks. If status quo can successfully protect 2/3 of the process, then it can all the more protect the whole 3 stages of it. A concrete example of such would be evident in our penal laws. For instance, ladies and gentlemen, in the crime of murder, our revised penal code does not only penalize the murder when the crime has been consummated. Rather, the law also imposes penalties in all stages in the perpetration of the crime: attempted, consummated, and frustrated. This is so because the law recognizes the fact that the violation of a person's right to life is not only violated in the end when the murder was consummated, but also in the stages where there is an attempt. Yes, sir.
Your proposition, does that include a situation where the offender does not know that the victim is a journalist?
Sir, it's impossible that an offender won't be able to know that that person covering him is a journalist because there are overt acts wherein journalists exercise when they are covering it, such as covering a person, such as recording, note-taking, and interviewing.
Why not? In one case, in that incident at the airport, the celebrities claim that they do not know. They did not know that particular person.
But then,
please answer briefly, Jamaica.
But then, Your Honor, it's impossible, and I guess it is undoubtable that these celebrities do not know Montulfo because, number one, he is a known journalist, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you, Jamaica.
That
Sorry, Your Honor, there's no more time for question and answers. Paul, 2 minutes now to cross-examine Jamaica.
Good evening, Micah.
Good evening.
First question. when an act of a journalist is unlawful or unethical, does that trample the rights of a third person?
Yes, but that's not what is being called for by the motion.
Yes, you said yes. On the second note, code of ethics are employed here in the Philippines, correct?
Yes.
Because there is a tendency coming from journalists to abuse their rights, correct?
But that is mere speculative.
No. Why?
There's a presumption of good faith.
Ma'am, if later, I will rebut that later. Anyway, proceeding to my interpellation, are judicial decisions interpretative of the laws, ma'am?
Yes.
Yes. So, therefore, if they are interpretative of the laws, did you cite any case that would prove your claim that violence per se constitutes as a violation of freedom of the press?
I'm sorry?
Did you cite any case that would tell us that violence per se constitutes as violation of freedom of the press? Did you cite any case?
That is discussed in the case of Chavez versus Gonzalez.
No, I read that case, ma'am. I will expound that later. Anyway, moving on. In the UNESCO report, does that provide that the Philippines is one of the countries that doesn't have any freedom of the press at all?
That's qualified, no qualified, yes. I'm not going to answer you unless you let me qualify.
Okay, anyway, proceeding to my interpellation, as law students, we are taught to adhere to the laws, correct?
Yes.
Therefore, we have to adhere and abide to whatever the law provides.
Yes.
And your case did not provide any proof that the violation of freedom of the press was cited on any case that a person enforced a violence against a journalist constituted as a violation of freedom of the press.
But that was discussed from my first speaker.
No, you didn't expounded it. You just had a mere conjecture, correct? Because you didn't have any case supporting that claim, correct?
Okay.
Because we haven't.
Time's up.
Because we haven't.
Break it up, guys. Paul, 4 minutes now to rebut Jamaica and advance your argument on why the proposition is not practicable.
Your Honors, the reason why the case of the affirmative bench would fall because they have two inconsistencies on their paradigm. First, they're telling us that they don't want to have restraints against journalists, but they are already conceding to the fact that the right to freedom of expression is not absolute. Isn't that a big inconsistency? Secondly, they want to use they want to employ unnecessary force. So they say that it's not necessary for us, yet they want to restrain these journalists from going to said particular places. Now, moving on to the rebuttals from the opposition side, Your Honors. We say that yes, freedom of the press is necessary and it's constitutional. That yes, the right of the people to know is constitutional as well. However, they never failed. They failed to tap at the first place the right of the people, of the third persons to privacy, which is actually enshrined as well in our Constitution. They only addressed, their paradigm only addressed all the rights of the journalists. We say that people also have their own rights. That even if journalists have right to know whatever that matter is, we say that the people also have to protect their rights, because we say that unlawful and unethical means may be employed by journalists. Yes, Your Honor.
Would not physical violence, whether committed against a journalist performing his duties as such, or any person for that matter, be a clear violation of existing criminal laws and the Constitution as well, absent any recognized justifying circumstances for the commission
Yes,
thereof?
Your Honor, I understand your question. In the case of People's Journal versus Tonin, it was ruled there that the right to freedom of expression is not absolute. Therefore, it should harmonize with other rights as well, like Article 19 of the Civil Code, which provides that a person should act with justice against other people. Therefore, we can't say that their paradigm would work even to other people, because they just told us that, you know what, journalists have this absolute right to perform their duties, and they're telling us that that right is not absolute, which is a very inconsistent claim. That cannot hold water, Your Honors. And with that, they are already killing their own arguments. And moving on, Your Honors, we say that they never tap the right of the people to have any, and they just demonized the society by telling that you know what? Journalists are being hurt in the Philippines through records. We tell you that act per se does not constitute as a violation of their freedom of the press, because as enunciated in the case of People's Journal versus Tionen, that there is this doctrine of necessary force so that you may avoid greater danger. That is what we are going for in the opposition side, which they failed to know at the first place, because they kept on reiterating on the fact that when violence per se is already incorrect. Mind you, Your Honors, in criminal law, there is a so-called self-defense. Therefore, when you kill a person because he or she provoked you, therefore, it is justified that you kill him because you're defending yourself. On that note, even on civil law, it is an established rule of doctrine of self-help, wherein a person may employ force so that he or she can protect her rights, or his or her rights. That's what we are going for, coming from the opposition side, because they're telling us that, you know what, violence is absolutely wrong. Yes, it is absolutely wrong. However, we say, but if it's necessary for us
Just
to employ
finish your
it,
sentence, Paul.
yes, if it's necessary for us to employ it so that no danger can be acquired by the journalist, then we should employ it. And with that,
Okay.
we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Jamaica, 2 minutes now to cross-examine him.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker.
Good evening.
Would you agree, or are you of the position that status quo is enough?
Yes.
Are you aware of the Maguindanao massacre?
Yeah, of course, definitely.
Are you aware that there is an average of 72 to 76 journalists killed yearly since 1996 in the performance of their duties?
Yes, but your paradigm doesn't solve the problem anyway.
Would you agree with me that the forces employed in these cases are unreasonable?
Of course. It's against human rights, but that's not what we're talking about here.
So I would ask you the question:
Yeah.
Are you still in the position that status quo is enough, given the proven unreasonable violence inflicted against journalists?
Ma'am, the problem is the status quo is the implementation, not the laws. Correct?
Yeah. The problem in the status quo is the implementation of the laws. Second set, ladies and gentlemen, are you aware that in status quo, justifiable force is already recognized?
Yes, that's
what you're forwarding, right?
Yes, that's present in our
Are
paradigm.
you aware that there are no jurisprudence recognizing unreasonable force
Ma'am,
inflicted upon media?
Ma'am, I cited the case of
Unreasonable force.
read
No.
the-
Unreasonable force. Answer me.
What?
Unreasonable. Are you aware that there are no jurisprudence recognizing
You
that
don't
there
have any
is?
jurisprudence either.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's the reason why we're forwarding this motion. The reason why we need to highlight is to enable us, or enable the courts and the laws to recognize that there are instances wherein unreasonable force is inflicted upon journalists.
Ma'am,
And ladies
yes.
and gentlemen,
You're
the
up.
fact
You're
that
supposed to ask me, ma'am.
and no, I'm just informing them.
Yeah,
and
yes.
the fact
I'm reminding
that
you.
and the fact that what the opposition
Okay,
is
time is up,
forwarding
Jamaica.
that-
Sorry, that's
that-
it. Jamaica, that's it.
Thank
The
you.
debate proper is over, guys. Thank you all very much. May we now invite both sides to cross the House as our judges tally the scores. Square Off, the CVC law debates will return after these messages.
CBC, Rex Bookstore, Hong Kong Roast Food Express.
Welcome back, and now for the results. Let's hear from our Chief Adjudicator, Judge Severino de Castro Jr. Your Honor, who did the judges pick for Best Speaker?
Before anything else, let me congratulate all the members of the debating team. For the winning team, the
Wait, sir! Oh, well, sabi na. Okay, winning team, okay.
The affirmative side of the University of Santo Tomas got it.
Okay. And the best speaker,
for
sir?
The best debater, It's John Henry Tamara.
All right.
Congratulations.
Congratulations to the University of Santo Tomas for winning the 7th round of this season's CBC Law Debates. Next week, law students from the University of Perpetual Help, Las Piñas, and San Beda College, Manila will battle it out for another round of Square Off. I'm Mikey Oreta. Thank you for watching.
The heinous crimes we are